Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to talk to you about the impact of sexist and sexual violence on mental health. Before we start, we wanted to put a trigger warning to your oral because we're going to talk about difficult things such as rape and sexual assault. If you think you're too sensitive about one of those subjects, or if this brings you back to hard feeling and memorize, we invite you to turn the sound down and to come back to use later. We also wanted to say that we cannot present the entirety of sexual violence consequences in 10 minutes. So what we're going to show you is far from being exhaustive.
If we want to talk about the impact of sexist and sexual violences on mental health, it's important to first define them. On this picture, you can see the violence continuum against women and gender minorities. We use the word continuum in terms of severity. Legally, a rape is considered more severe than a sexual exhibition, but also in terms of frequency, rape is less frequent than sexual harassment. It's also a continuum because those violences are closely intertwined within each other in a whole system. For example, sexual harassment can lead to sexual assault, which can lead to rape and so on. The offensive sexist behavior designs an act associated with the person's gender which violates, intentionally or not, their dignity or which creates a humiliating effect. For example, criticizing a woman because she's not feminine enough, or on the contrary, because of her neckline, using sexist names or insults in the street, etc. Sexual harassments refer to unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal and or physical conduct of a sexual nature in the workplace or learning environment. A sexual harassment can include many things like unwanted pressure for dates, sexual teasing, jokes, remarks, or questions, but contrariwise to offensive sexist acts, those behaviors are often repeated and regular. Sexual assault refers to sexual contact or behavior that occurs without the consent of the victim. In the law, sexual assault includes unwanted contact with breasts, mouth, sex, butt, or between the thighs. 1 in 5 women reports having been sexually assaulted during their lifetime. Finally, rape involves sexual penetration carried out against a person without that person's consent, using violence, surprise, or a threatening behavior. In France, at least 94,000 rapes or attempted rapes are counted every year. Thanks to Gisèle Halimi's law in 1980, it's considered as a crime. Worldwide, 120 million girls, 1 in 10, have been raped, and a recent WHO report points out that nearly 20% of women and 5 to 10% of men report having experienced a sexual violence during their childhood. So now that we have seen the continuum of sexist and sexual violences, we're going to see the anxiety and depression linked with sexist and sexual violence. So, the majority of sexual violences are perpetrated by men against women. In France, for example, 91% of sexual violences victims are women or gender minorities. In this oral, we're going to mostly talk about female victims, but we mustn't forget that men can also be victims of sexual violences. Moreover, the majority of male victims were raped or sexually assaulted by men. Lots of researches show strong links between sexual violences and poor mental health, including anxiety and depression. According to an ANROSE study, ANROSE stands for Australia's National Research of Women's Safety, women are mostly linked to be sexually assaulted or raped by someone they already know, or even by someone who lives with them in the same house. Thus, sexual and sexist violences in the hands of an intimate partner or family member is associated with a higher risk of repeated attacks, which causes a lot of stress and increase feelings of shame.
So, in the case of domestic violence, some victims dare not talk to anyone about what they're living and thus don't receive the help they actually need. Their abuser can also be very manipulative and switch between violent behaviors one day and lovely compliments the other day, so that the victim stays under their influence. This whole violence mechanism causes a lot of anxiety because the victim lives in an environment which is full of doubt and insecurity. And this is not a rare phenomenon at all, but a real social issue. Nowadays, 1 woman out of 10 will undergo through domestic violence during their lifetime. And now I'm going to describe you the cycle of violence mechanisms on this board. So, right on this sheen, you have the cycle of violence mechanisms. So, in the 2 first phases, the increase of tension leads to the crisis or violence peak, which is when the violence occurs. And a few days after, you have the abuser's denial, which is when the abuser tries to find himself excuses. For example, yes, I've been violent, but your meal was awful. Or yes, I've been violent, but look at how you've been talking to me, etc., etc. And then comes the honeymoon phase, when the abuser tries to ensure his impunity by making compliments, buying gifts, for example, or by appearing as his best in front of the victim's relatives. In a violent couple or relationship, those cycles gradually accelerate and the honeymoon phase ends up disappearing from the cycle.
Then traumas and sexual violences. In this part, we're mostly going to talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is very common with victims of sexual violence, especially rape and sexual assault. First, a traumatic event is one in which a person experiences something that is frightening, overwhelming, and that entails a sense of loss of control. Everyone will react differently to traumatic events because we all have different past life experiences. It is helpful for those in the criminal justice system to understand the neurobiology of trauma in order to understand reactions victims might exhibit in threatening circumstances. Sexual assault and rape are experiences of trauma, which have a neurobiological impact that affect our brain and nervous system. For this reason, it is therefore essential to act on the impact of trauma on victims of sexual assault so they can deal it more effectively. Indeed, the impact of the sexual assault or rape depends on many factors. For example, these factors include the nature of the assault itself, the victim's relationship to the perpetrator, for example in case of incest, whether the victim has had an earlier childhood history of abuse or neglect, and how family, friends, police, and others respond to what the victim says about the assault.
Victims may experience the impact of sexual assault or rape physically and psychologically over both the short and long term. These impacts can include anger, anxiety, hypervigilance, a tendency to minimize or deny the experience to cope or even also, tendency to isolate oneself, feeling of detachment, a feeling of shame. Also, victims may experience other symptoms such as sleep disturbance, cognitive impairment, eating disorder, addictions, etc.
Now I talk about the reconstruction. The work for a victim is not only psychological, but the victim's care path also includes repairing the body. He can go through bodily therapies which are then used to express emotion, to put the story behind oneself, to find the bodily envelope that was abandoned during the trauma. But also art therapy can play this part. Specialists develop a precise and elaborate treatment protocol to best help the victim in his reconstruction. Massages, gestalt therapy, transgenerational work, vegetable therapy are also tools that can be used by the therapist. At the end of this therapy, the person will be able to integrate their body again, feel sensation, return to pleasure, etc. Also, sport, fencing for example, teaches the victim to reconnect with his body. The body is put back into motion while it often remains motionless and brutes. Energy circulates again. Equitherapy, swimming, throwing sports are activities which often lead to an acceptance of femininity and consequently to the improvement of self-esteem. These bodily activities can help lead to the reconciliation of soul and body.
To conclude, we must say that if we want sexist and sexual violence to head, a huge work of education and prevention has to be done at a very early age. For example, learning kids what asking for consent is. Institutions such as schools, universities and police have to be much more formed on this subject, so that the victims can testify, complain and be heard. In France, only 1% of victims see their rapist sentenced.
Those violences, in addition to not be decreasing over time, have a real impact on the survivor's mental health. Anxiety, depression, sometimes post-traumatic stress, not being believed or taken seriously, being culpabilized, etc., etc. And today, even if most of the rapes actually occur in the private sphere, which is because 9 women out of 10 actually know their rapist in their personal life, some women are still afraid to come home late at night because they're scared to be sexually assaulted or raped, and that's still a reality. So talking about those violences around us, their statistics, their impacts, is actually the first thing to do if we want to help victims to be heard and to be supported as they should. Some numbers in France exist if you think you are a victim of violences or if you know someone who does. 3919, 3919. And if you are deaf or hard of hearing, you can also call the 114, 114. You can call them and they will help you. Thank you for listening.